The Wild West, you picture it, right? Saloons slamming, six-shooters blazing, the air thick with the scent of gunpowder and the sound of boots on wooden planks. It's a scene straight out of a dime novel, where every corner holds a new adventure, and every stranger could be a friend or foe. Cowboys riding high in the saddle, looking for adventure. The horizon stretching out endlessly before them, a canvas of opportunity and danger. They were the knights of the plains, their horses their trusty steeds, and their six-shooters their swords. They roamed the land, seeking fortune, fame, or sometimes just a place to call home. Movies, TV shows, they've all painted a picture that's more fantasy than fact. Hollywood has given us tales of heroism and romance, of epic showdowns and legendary outlaws, but the reality was far grittier, far more complex. The Wild West was a place where dreams could be made or shattered in an instant, where the line between hero and villain was often blurred. Don't get me wrong, the Wild West was a time of incredible change, but it was brutal. The land was unforgiving, the weather harsh, and the dangers ever-present. It was a place where only the toughest survived, where every day was a battle against the elements, against hunger, against each other. We're talking about life on the edge of a knife, where the line between survival and disaster was thinner than a gambler's promise. Every decision could mean the difference between life and death. A wrong move, a moment of hesitation, and it could all be over. The stakes were high, and the margin for error was razor thin. Now, I'm not saying there weren't moments of excitement, even heroism. There were tales of bravery, of selflessness, of people standing up for what was right in the face of overwhelming odds. These stories are the stuff of legend, the kind of tales that get passed down through generations, growing grander with each retelling. But for every gunslinger with a quick draw, there were 100 folks just trying to make it through the day without dying of dysentery or getting scalped. The everyday reality for most was a struggle for survival. They were farmers, blacksmiths, shopkeepers, and families, all trying to carve out a life in a land that seemed determined to break them. We're talking about a time when the simplest things, clean water, a roof overhead, could be the difference between life and death. Imagine having to walk miles just to find a stream, only to discover it's dried up, or building a shelter from whatever scraps you could find, hoping it would hold up against the next storm. These were the daily challenges that defined life on the frontier. Let's ditch the Hollywood version and dig into the real dirt of the Wild West, shall we? Think about it. No antibiotics, no hospitals, no 911. If you got hurt, you had to rely on whatever rudimentary medical knowledge was available, often just a few herbs and a lot of hope. If you got sick, you were at the mercy of the elements and your own body's ability to fight off infection. You got hurt, got sick, you were pretty much on your own. There were no safety nets, no emergency services to come to your aid. It was a harsh reality that many faced, and it took a toll on the body and the spirit. The frontier was a place that tested the limits of human endurance and resilience, and don't even get me started on the bugs, the swarms of insects that could drive a person mad, the constant buzzing and biting, the ever-present threat of disease they carried. It was a battle just to keep them at bay, a never-ending struggle against nature's smallest yet most persistent adversaries. Let's just say out here, bug spray ain't about smelling good, it's about staying alive. It was a necessity, a vital tool in the fight for survival. The Wild West was a place where every day was a test, where only the strong, the resourceful, and the lucky made it through. So next time you think of the Wild West, remember the dreams, but don't forget the dust. First things first, forget what you've seen in the movies. The Wild West wasn't all about gunfights, saloons, and heroic cowboys. It was a harsh, unforgiving land where survival was a daily struggle. The romanticized version of the West often leaves out the grittier details, especially when it comes to something as essential as water. Clean water? In the Wild West? That was a luxury few could afford. The arid landscape made finding fresh water a constant challenge. Rivers and streams were often dry, and when they did flow, they were far from clean. Imagine trekking miles under the scorching sun, only to find a dry riverbed or an empty canteen. The scarcity of water was a daily reminder of the harsh realities of frontier life. We're talking about folks drinking from rivers that doubled as baths and toilets for both people and animals. The same water source that quenched your thirst was also where cattle drank, people bathed, and waste was disposed of. It was a breeding ground for bacteria and disease. The concept of sanitation was almost non-existent, and the consequences were dire. Is it any wonder diseases like cholera and typhoid ran rampant? These waterborne diseases spread like wildfire, decimating entire communities. Hospitals were ill-equipped, and medical knowledge was limited. The lack of clean water turned simple illnesses into deadly epidemics. The Grim Reaper wore dirty water, and he was an all-too-familiar figure in the Wild West. Imagine this: you wake up thirsty, but that cup of water could be a death sentence. Every sip was a gamble with your life. The murky water in your cup was a cocktail of contaminants, and you knew it. Yet the choice was stark: drink and risk illness, or don't drink and face dehydration. It was a lose-lose situation that left many in a constant state of fear and uncertainty. Folks were dying from something as basic as dehydration because the water they could find was so polluted it'd make a sewer rat cringe. The ground was often cracked and dry, a testament to the relentless heat and lack of rainfall. Polluted water sources were the norm, not the exception. Trash and waste floated in the water, making it a last resort for desperate souls. And forget about doctors. Most towns were lucky to have a veterinarian, let alone someone who could tell the difference between measles and smallpox. Medical facilities were scarce, and trained professionals even scarcer. The local vet often doubled as the town doctor, treating both animals and humans with whatever limited resources were available. It was a makeshift system that left much to be desired. Think about living with constant stomach cramps, fever, the kind of misery that leaves you begging for death. The symptoms of waterborne diseases were relentless and unforgiving. Stomach cramps, fever, and dehydration were common, turning everyday life into a painful ordeal. The lack of effective treatment options meant that many suffered in silence, their bodies ravaged by illness. Now imagine watching your family go through the same thing. The emotional toll was immense. Parents watched helplessly as their children succumbed to illness. Families were torn apart by disease, their bonds tested by the relentless struggle for survival. The sense of helplessness was overwhelming, as there was little they could do to protect their loved ones. That was the reality for a lot of folks in the Wild West. The romanticized image of the frontier life often glosses over these harsh truths. The struggle for survival was real, and it was fought on multiple fronts. Water, or the lack thereof, was a constant battle that shaped the lives of those who dared to venture into the Wild West. The fight for survival started with the most basic element: water. It was a daily quest that defined the existence of many. The search for clean water was a matter of life and death, a struggle that left an indelible mark on the history of the Wild West. The Grim Reaper wore dirty water, and his presence was a stark reminder of the fragility of life on the frontier. Now let's talk about law and order, or the lack thereof. The Wild West, a time and place romanticized by countless movies and TV shows, was far from the glamorous image often portrayed. It was a land where the rule of law was more of a suggestion than a reality, and survival often depended on one's wits, strength, and sometimes sheer luck. Hollywood loves a good saloon brawl, but the reality of violence in the Wild West was far less romantic and way more brutal. These weren't choreographed fights with stunt doubles. They were raw, chaotic, and often deadly. A simple disagreement over a card game or a spilled drink could quickly escalate into a full-blown brawl, with fists flying, chairs breaking, and sometimes guns being drawn. Imagine towns so small, so desperate, they didn't even have a sheriff. These were places where the nearest lawman could be miles away, and by the time he arrived it might be too late. In such an environment, people had to take the law into their own hands. Vigilante justice was common, and lynch mobs were not unheard of. It was a harsh and unforgiving world where the strong preyed on the weak, and the concept of justice was often twisted and perverted. Justice was often decided by whoever had the fastest draw or the most bullets. Duels were a common way to settle disputes, and they were not the romanticized, honorable affairs depicted in movies. They were brutal, bloody, and often fatal. A man's reputation could be made or broken in a matter of seconds, and the consequences of losing were dire. In a world where life was cheap, and death was always just around the corner, people had to be constantly on their guard. Think about it. You're a rancher, working your tail off to build something for your family. Every day is a struggle, from dawn till dusk, battling the elements, wild animals, and the ever-present threat of rustlers. You pour your blood, sweat, and tears into your land, hoping to carve out a better future for your children. But in the Wild West, nothing is guaranteed, and everything can be taken away in an instant. But your neighbor, he's got his eye on your land, your cattle. He sees what you've built, and he wants it for himself. In a place where the law is weak and might makes right, he knows he can take it if he's willing to use force. And in the Wild West there were plenty of men who were more than willing to do just that. It was a constant battle for survival, where trust was a rare commodity, and betrayal was always a possibility. He's bigger, meaner, and he ain't afraid to use force. In a world where the strong dominated the weak, intimidation was a powerful tool. A man with a reputation for violence could get what he wanted without ever having to draw his gun. But when words failed, and threats were not enough, violence was always an option. And in the Wild West, violence was a way of life. Who you gonna call? There's no 911 in the Wild West. When trouble came knocking, you were on your own. You had to rely on yourself, your family, and maybe a few trusted friends. But even then, there were no guarantees. In a land where danger lurked around every corner and death was a constant companion, you had to be ready for anything. It was a time when disputes were often settled with fists, knives, and guns. The Wild West was a violent place where the rule of law was often overshadowed by the rule of the gun. In a world where life was cheap and death was always just a heartbeat away, people had to be tough, resourceful, and always ready to fight for what they believed in. It was a harsh and unforgiving land where only the strong survived. And let's not forget the everyday dangers. The Wild West was a place where danger was a constant companion. From the threat of Indian attacks to the ever-present risk of disease, life was a constant struggle. People had to be tough, resourceful, and always on their guard. In a land where the weak were preyed upon, and the strong ruled with an iron fist, survival was never guaranteed. One bad hand of cards, one too many shots of rot-gut whiskey, could land you in a fight for your life. The saloons of the Wild West were places of danger and excitement, where fortunes could be won or lost in an instant. But they were also places of violence, where a simple disagreement could quickly escalate into a deadly brawl. In a world where life was cheap, and death was always just a heartbeat away, people had to be tough, resourceful, and always ready to fight for what they believed in. The Wild West was a pressure cooker of tension, and sometimes all it took was a spark to set the whole thing off. In a land where the rule of law was weak and violence was a way of life, people had to be constantly on their guard. One wrong move, one careless word, and the whole town could erupt into chaos. It was a harsh and unforgiving world where only the strong survived, and the weak were left to fend for themselves. Remember those mouth-watering barbecue scenes in westerns? Well, chuck that image right out the window. Food in the Wild West was about survival, not flavor. We're talking a steady diet of beans, bacon, and hardtack, if you were lucky. Forget about fresh fruits and vegetables unless you count the occasional wild onion. Imagine this. You're traveling west, weeks from the nearest town. Your supplies are running low, and the hunting's been poor. You're looking at your family, their faces gaunt with hunger. What do? The Wild West had a way of turning ordinary folks into scavengers, foragers, and sometimes even worse. And let's not forget the elements. One hailstorm, one infestation, could wipe out a season's worth of crops. Food insecurity wasn't just a concern, it was a constant companion. In the Wild West, every bite was a victory, a testament to your grit and determination.